studio at That Nerd Show. I am Marcus Blake speaking with director Jason Loftus over his film, Eternal Spring, dealing with the use of animation to tell a story, especially a political one. And we're going to dive right in and get to why everybody needs to check this film out. So, Jason, thank you for joining us. I got to admit that I love the use of animation for a story that I didn't really know much about. And I'm going to start with probably the one question you get right off in the beginning, but we just want to know it for our audience. How did this project come to you? What was the inspiration behind it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I was making a Kung Fu video game, a narrative game, actually, a few years ago called Shuyan Saga. It starred Kristen Krug from Smallville and Beauty and the Beast. And so it featured, so that was a few years back, and it featured a bunch of hand-drawn comic art, sort of visual novel style with some 3D Kung Fu combat in it. And we heard about this artist who was originally from China, and he was living in New York. His name is Dashong, and he'd drawn for Justice League and Star Wars, all the big comic franchises, but also he'd worked with Louis Cha, who was sort of the preeminent Kung Fu novelist in China. So I thought, this is great. The guy's got the amazing artistic talent, but also he's got the cultural background to help us make some real authentic Kung Fu scenes here. So he came up and he helped us with about 1,400 hand-drawn art panels in the game. And then while working with him, we started to learn more about him. And I said, oh, hold on, you come from the same hometown as my wife and filmmaking partner, Masha Loftus. They both come from Changchun, which is a city in the northeast of the country. Now, my wife was the daughter of a mid-level government official there. So she had no connection with any religious or dissident communities and didn't realize what people had been suffering right under her nose in her own city. I myself, I was familiar with the group that Dashong belongs to, the community of Falun Gong. I was sympathetic to the human rights situation in China. So collectively, for both my wife and I, we had this real fascination with the subject and really resonating with the story, because Dashong, he had to leave his home behind. He had to flee in the aftermath of this dramatic hijacking of the state TV airwaves in China by adherents of the Falun Gong practice in China. And essentially, this is their response to the persecution, the ban that they were facing, and this sort of continuous, slandering in the Chinese state media, saying that their practice is bad and that they're dangerous and evil and all these kinds of things. So they felt they had no recourse except to climb the television poles with sort of home DVD players. They were actually CD-ROMs essentially at the time, and broadcast a message to counter the state narrative. So first of all, it's just like, wow, this is a crazy heist story, a real life heist story that's just already written for you. And it has a real human consequence to it. And for whatever reason, it's like no one has approached this. Of course, I think it's a difficult story to tell. But at the same time, the other thing that excited me from a filmmaker perspective was just seeing Dashong draw, like especially when he's drawing anything about his home or what he'd been through personally. It's just his illustrations are so evocative and they just bring you, there's a sense of place right away. So the question immediately is, well, how can we tell this story and how can we use his art to tell it? And, the thing is, the illustration that he can do is awesome, but also, comic illustrations are static and they're flat. And so how can we really bring people into this space? And so that's where we kind of iterated. And fortunately, we had the opportunity to work with him on the Kung Fu video game, because we were iterating on this. How do we use the 2D illustrations and the hyper detail that he has in his work, but also really give a sense of place by bringing you in a 3D environment? So we would have him sort of storyboard a scene, and then we would build it in Maya and take pictures in the space from different camera angles, and we would print those out on just 2D sheets. So essentially at that point, we were just building like gray boxes, right? And so he would go and on these sheets, he would draw all the detail. And because he was doing it from multiple camera angles, we could then scan those pieces and drape them into Maya. And so when we would move the camera through the space, we would now get all the detail that you have in the 2D illustrations. You could see it even in like the taxi cabs and the street trolley. If you look closely in the film, you can see even markers because he's hand colored those things, right? So you have this kind of 2D aesthetic, this hand-drawn, hand-colored aesthetic, but you have it with the 3D perspective where the camera can move through the space and you can get this sense that you're somewhere that's rich and full.
Yeah, see, and I didn't even know you could actually do that. I mean, obviously, video games is a big part of what we cover, and as well as comics. I mean, we know of him from comics.
Right.
In fact, one of my comic experts, when she saw the list, is like, "Are you interviewing him?" Like, I don't think we're interviewing him, but there's a different story about where he comes from, and that's so.
Yeah, he's like a mainstay at the San Diego Comic-Con. I think he's been
Yeah.
there for 10 or 15 years or more, right? So he
Right.
knows his stuff in the comic space, and it was unique. I don't know if others have done exactly what we've done in terms of like draping the hand drawings into the 3D spaces, but it was something that would allow us to keep both the authenticity with the immersion, I think, in this case.
Well, but I think, again, how many people know this story about him, though? I mean, we don't.
Yes, that's
from
right.
From our world, we're more interested in what he has drawn, which is absolutely amazing. But when I read this, I was like, wait a minute.
That's a great point. You know what? And that's really something we're hoping with this film too, is that, the comics crowd, the people who are already into him because of what he's been able to do, would also be interested that someone, one of their own, someone in their world is got this remarkable personal story and has gone through a lot to be able to tell it as well. So we're hoping that that this film will resonate with the comics crowd.
Sure. I also have a little bit of a personal motive of why I wanted to do this interview. My background, my history degree is actually the study of modern China. I wrote my thesis on the Communist Revolution and then did a little bit more work into the Cultural Revolution and stuff. I was always fascinated by China more than other parts, especially that revolutionary era. So it's always a great irony of we have this great communist revolution against, the nationalists, and we want our freedom. And yet, you're the same side of the coin where you have state TV and, you can't have religious freedom and stuff. And whether you agree with it or not, that's the thing that we take for granted in this country is you do have religious freedom. I don't know if some of them deserve it, but but that's a whole different discussion if you do. I remember hearing about this in college. I was about to go off into the Army right about when this was happening. So the hacking story, because again, that's another thing that we're always interested in.
Yep.
Did you know much about it? I mean, did your wife tell you some part of what had happened?
Yeah, a little bit. So my wife was in Beijing at the time the event took place, because that's where she did her undergraduate degree at Peking University. But her parents were home when this took place. The thing was, her excuse me, her father being just one sec. Her father being a government official was very careful with things. So, he mentioned, it was only later on that he kind of told her, I'm familiar with Falun Gong, and, I knew that it was being unjustly persecuted and that they were good people because of my experience being in the party. But if I tell you this, then, you could say something. My wife was pretty outspoken for a Chinese person. So he was worried about her getting herself into trouble. So they didn't talk about it. But, you see that, right? And you see the kind of impact that it had on regular people in Changchun who were able to witness the efforts of these people to sort of counter the narrative and realize, wow, it might seem like they lost in the sense that they suffered so much, but they did achieve what they were after. There's people there who no longer will believe in the state narrative about them because of the efforts that they had to sort of counter that. Sorry, I got off a little off track. Your question.
Well, I wanted to know if you had knew a little bit about it.
So I had known, probably similar to you. I knew that this event took place. I remembered it. I've had a longstanding interest in the human rights situation in China. I was familiar with Falun Gong, but I had no idea what went on or how this was pulled off. And I don't think many people did, really. I mean, when we started on this journey, Dashong knew some other people from Changchun who were living in New York. We started with that. And those people knew other people who were also from Changchun, and they knew the people closer. So we started to expand the network a little bit. And it's like, okay, well, now we can piece together who these people are, little bits of what they did. But it wasn't until we learned about Mr. White, that's the alias he used, the one man who was directly involved in the hijacking. And he's, to our knowledge, the only surviving hijacker who's managed to get out of China. Then that was what made the whole story come alive and made this thing really possible, because then you learn the whole heist story. You learn what their motivations were. You learn the challenges that they ran into, and I don't think anyone's had that before. And he was in China in a prison until recently, right? So just a few years he's been out. So no one knew the details.
It's funny when the first time that I heard about it from a guy in college that, was all into this. He was the dark web before there's dark web. So, I mean, his first response to it, dude, we've got a modern day version of hackers. Hack the planet, dude.
Right.
Yeah. So, of course, like, you want to know more about it. But at the same time, when I watched this, we all know that the man standing in front of a tank in Tiananmen Square it's such an iconic image. It's embedded in our culture. But I looked at these illustrations and telling this story as this is a modern take of that iconic image. It's something that we've never seen before in a way to tell this kind of story. And documentaries are great, but I also think that it makes it a little bit easier, when you're watching a documentary, but you're also having to deal with subtitles to get the full scope of the story. So my question is that where that starting point was for you? Is we want to know more, but we want to do this through illustration, or did that kind of come later?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a few things going on in your head as you're trying to figure out how to tell a story, and obviously when you come across someone who's got a personal experience with something, and he also has this amazing artistic ability, and he's willing to go there, because he's experienced trauma. This guy's been arrested a few times. That's something that, isn't necessarily known by a lot of his fans in the comic space, but he did a Wall Street Journal sort of video interview, even when he first came out of China a decade ago or so. And he talked about it. Like, he'd been in prison, he'd been tortured. And so you don't know how comfortable is he going there. But this was the exciting thing for me, is that approaching it with him, and fortunately he was open to doing this, is that the art becomes a bit of a character in the film, in the sense that his own process of coming to terms with what he'd faced, of kind of retracing these events, of dealing with his nostalgia and his longing for his home, and and all of those things, you can see it coloring you can see it in his illustrations, you can see it in the art. But instead of other documentary films that have used animation, where that's kind of like this invisible decision, the invisible hand of the director has said, we're going to use animation to bring this alive. Here you pull a curtain back, because it's meta in that sense. You're seeing him create it. You're seeing him hear the testimony from other witnesses and draw it, and you're seeing the results of that work. So that to me was exciting, because then you're putting art under the microscope. And what power does art have to help us come to an understanding of something, to hopefully gain some like closure, catharsis, healing, And so that to me was interesting. And that was what was unique about this. So it took a while to figure out exactly how we were going to do it, but I wanted both. One is it's also practical, because there's people here you can't interview, right? So you can bring them to life in animation, but you can't go there. You can't go to some of these places. You can't speak with some of these people directly, because they're not there. So that was a practical thing too, but I think mostly it was the artistic element that was exciting about this, is to have this back and forth. But then the big question, and that took a lot of iteration, is how do you go from the live action, where you're in the live action, the benefit of that is that you're substantiating it. This is real. You can see real people. You can see the emotion in their faces. You can see them during their testimony. But how do you go from that and into the into the animation and not make it feel broken or disjointed? And so that's where the innovation, I think, took some time and took some effort.
So right now you're on the film festival circuit. Have many people seen this film outside of that circuit?
So yeah, just by nature of how that works, there's sort of a windowing. So you're in your festival run. We're getting great interest on the distribution front right now, which is fantastic. And the festival run definitely supports that. I mean, we worked on this. It stretched over 5 to 6 years, basically, partly just because it's a small team and it's a really unique project. And so we had to work on it while doing other things for a bit. And it just took a lot of energy. So you don't know what you're going to get when you start sharing it with people. You're close to it. You're like, this story really hit me. I want other people to have that same experience in 90 minutes, right? And so you don't know what you're going to get. But we premiered it in Thessaloniki. We won the audience prize there. We won a prize from the Greek Parliament. Similar, both audience prizes at Hot Docs, which is one of the largest doc fests in the world. So you go there. and you're getting this kind of reaction, it's really, really encouraging. But then, so now we're starting to line up the distribution interest as a result of it.
Well, it leads me to my next question is, with putting this story out there, has he gotten any pushback, threats, or anything, or has this been more or less well received?
Yeah, so Dashong personally has already, having to leave his home behind, he's also already been cut off in a lot of respects in China. He can't return there. He's got family. He's had to adjust. But I found it, even as a filmmaker on this, that threat from China was real. So in the midst of making this film, I was making 2 human rights docs at the same time. There was this one that stretched over 5 or 6 years, and there was one that took me, a little less than 2 years that I did in the midst of that. And we were at the same time publishing the video game that Dashong and I had started our journey with, right? And that was being published by Tencent, which is a major media company in China, huge player in the gaming space. And they were just launching us up on WeGame, and we were all over the homepage in 6 different places. They were like, this is a big splash. And we had already passed through the different censorship offices. There's 2 different ministries in the Chinese government that have to review your game. We had all the certificates, everything was in order. We're launching, and all of a sudden our game disappears. And I finally reached the Tencent rep, and basically I'm told, you know what, we were told by the Chinese government, they visited us, told us we had to cut ties with your company. And they said, it's not the game, it's you. And then they asked me, are you doing something not aligned with the Chinese government direction? At the same time, my wife starts hearing from family members in China. They're getting calls from the Public Security Bureau in the northeast of China, and they're being told, we know what you're up to overseas, this kind of like veiled threat, right? And all of these people, we believe, are coming from my wife's WeChat contact list, because both business and personal, these are all in. So we feel that WeChat is likely complicit in this as well. And it just hits home, because you're like, wow, man, this, people are always concerned about upsetting China, what's going to happen to business and all this kind of stuff. And you're like, yeah, that's legit, that's real. But at the same time, you meet these people who are coming out of China, and they've risked their lives. In some cases, they've lost their lives, or they've lost their freedom just to be able to speak up. And if we make that same calculation that, well, it might be inconvenient for me or whatnot, if I tell this story, then where's this story going to go? That's why no one's told this story for 20 years. It's sensitive. It's difficult, right? But at the same, then you persist and you say, we're going to tell this story. And then you get this kind of response that we're getting from festivals. And then you're like, you know what? It feels like it's worthwhile. There's other people who feel the same way. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to tell you from our industry and our standpoint, yeah, it's absolutely worth it. You guys need to tell this story, and we need to know more about him. I love his personal story. I mean, having known him from the comic book world, again, that's why we found it very, very fascinating. All right, one last question, and I'm going to get to our nerdy question and do wrap up here. But the game, whatever happened with it?
Yeah, so you can. It's we self-published it on. It's on Steam. It's on mobile. It'll actually. It's going to have another life. It'll be on consoles again shortly as well. Okay. It was nominated for Best Canadian Screen Award for Best Original Interactive Production in Canada in 2018.
Game again for our audience?
It's called Shuyan Saga. So it's essentially a visual novel with some kung fu combat in it. Check it out. I'd appreciate it. We lost the 10-cent business. We'd love yours.
Well, we're always looking for more independent games. Like, we love Game Pass with Xbox. I think that has been such a game changer to find games that we normally wouldn't. And there's so many smaller games that it's kind of hard to get through press releases and stuff, especially when you're having to cover the big ones. So
for sure, I get it.
We definitely want to check it out. All right. So it brings us to our nerdy question that we ask all of our filmmakers. If you could have a weapon of choice or a superpower from within the nerd universe to fight the forces of evil, what would you choose? And you can do a combo if you want more than one.
Yeah, that's great. I think sometimes, although I have a weak stomach, I think sometimes I would just like to fly, because I want to be able to just, fighting the forces of evil. Sometimes you want to come at it from a different perspective, and also sometimes you just need to get away. So.
Yeah, I kind of feel like Superman. That's the thing we don't often see in comics. Like, okay, enough is enough, rescuing people. I just got to get away. Lois Lane, I got to just get away and have some me time.
I'll call you. I'll call you.
Yeah. We know what Tom Welling as Superman was doing in Smallville every time he went to the. Great answer. Well, Jason, I want to congratulate you on this project. Like I said, in our industry, it needs to be told. It's great, and it adds another dimension to a comic book artist that we are very familiar with. And again, with the game, it might not have worked out with the Chinese company, but I still think it's worth it to tell this story.
We feel so too. Thank you, Marcus.